Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 22nd episode of Conceptualism. I'm happy to have with me here Joseph Glaser, who is a composer, conductor, and sound artist who works in interdisciplinary spaces. Um, I have been following your work since we met in Montreal, um, probably a year and a half ago, maybe.
Yeah, I was
Um,
gonna say year and a half, 2 years ago, something like that.
That's right. Yes, and yeah, and I want to tell the story of how we met. Actually, I came to the establishment that you were working at, and we struck up a conversation, and then we shared a cab ride home, and we had an interesting, wide-ranging conversation about music and art and politics and philosophy, and yeah, it's wonderful because I was totally not expecting that conversation.
Yeah, not something you'd expect at like what was it, like 2 in the morning on whatever day in a taxi ride. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was great, and I'm really glad that that happened. Um, so yeah, you've been doing some interesting work. You've done some different projects. You studied at McGill and also at UBC. Um, and
Yeah, yeah. So I did my undergrad at UBC.
Go ahead.
Um, I did my undergrad at UBC and my master's at McGill, and uh, that's my most recent education.
And you've done work with the Griffin Trio, and then there's also this improvisation experimental collective ear camera that was based in Montreal when you lived there.
For my, I'm cutting in a little bit. You're asking about your camera?
Yes, I was asking about ear camera. Yeah, the experimental music collective that you co-founded.
Yes. So Ear Camera was it was a project that I did basically in the tail end of my studies. I was working in this pretty academically minded institution and feeling a little bit constrained um, by the need to be so tied to notation and to sort of academic modes of music production and the concert hall in general as well. So I got a group of more or less like-minded uh, people together to see how we could do things differently a little bit. And that became your camera, and for disbanding because everybody kind of left Montreal, including myself. But in those four concerts we did things interestingly. It was we tried to sort of flatten the hierarchy a little bit. We did the first piece we did was a piece called Tombstones by Michael Passaro, which is more or less designed as sort of like a it's notated, it's sheet music, but it's sort of enigmatically laid out on the page, and is sort of promoting more of a kind of rock band feel the rehearsal practice. There's a lot of decisions that need to be made in that piece, um, and that was a really good way of sort of orienting ourselves when we first started, of thinking about music in that way of more like, we when we're in rehearsal we're also making decisions, and we're shaping how this piece comes out rather than figuring out, just, okay, well, you got to play your note there, I got to play my note there,
Yeah.
uh, let's do it. And then from then on we went to more original work, and we were sort of working towards uh, the idea of the evening itself being our I don't want to say product, but our our presentation. So we would do multiple works in an evening, but we would create a narrative that flow, out of that set of pieces.
Right.
And we did that probably most successfully in two concerts. One called Body Language, which we did in Montreal, and that in that piece we did two pieces that were from an outside composer that we sort of worked on together. A similar style of things that needed a lot of interpretation and needed a lot of input from all of us. But then we did two other original pieces that were all about how we move in the space, how we interact with each other, how our bodies affect our the musicianship, and then the second piece was or the second evening was Family Gathering, which we did. It was all original work from your camera that we did, and then we sort of based the feel of the evening on a sort of family holiday. It's Christmas is coming up. I think Christmas is a good example, or Hanukkah, as it would be for me. You come together, you eat some food, you do some obscure ritual, and you then have fun. And that was sort of the trajectory that we had. There was a ritual. There was a piece using pots and pans and glasses. There was a piece that was very much in the style of a conversation, and then there was a piece where that was reacting to film and movie stuff. So that was the sort of the idea with that. And so I think that gives more or less a good idea of how your camera operated. We also, I mean, it was very much about this idea that we're getting into the space without preformed ideas. That when we get into the space, we have something that we want to try out, and we're going to try it out, and then we're going to make decisions together. And that was basically the if I can summarize Ear Camera in a sentence, that would be what we were after.
Well, that's really interesting, and it kind of reminds me of the the idea of performance art and sort of conceptual art or like interventions of a certain kind, where it's it's not a concert in the traditional sense of the word, whatever that means.
Yeah, and I think I know me personally, I'm very influenced by those art genres and those art styles. I was reading a lot before making Your Camera. I was reading a lot about happenings and about the Fluxus movement and
Right.
and stuff like that. And so part of the idea of Your Camera was to okay, well, what does a postmodern happening look like? How does a happening, a millennial happening look like?
Right.
So this is sort of what we came up with. We were a little bit, I would say we were a little bit more sincere. We were a little bit more invested in beauty and making beautiful things than traditional happenings.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's part of what makes it millennial and postmodern.
Right. For sure. And I mean, it's. I mean, I'm assuming that like the instrumentation was also a little bit unconventional. Like I'm not sure what your instrumentation was. What did the members of the ensemble play?
So it was a real hodgepodge. And we also swapped around a bunch. We had one. I mean, so we had one guy who he plays guitar, bass, and piano, and percussion. We had an electric violinist, a saxophonist, a cellist, a trumpet player, a couple of singers, myself who played mostly junk and sometimes a junky harmonium that I had. And yeah, I don't want to leave people out. We had a trombone at one point, and I mean, also the membership fluctuated, which.
Right.
So I mean, I'm listing off a large amount of things too. A tubist as well. I'm listing a large amount of instruments, but and people, but not everybody played in every iteration of
Right.
the ensemble.
Right. So it was in that sense it was a collective. It was a, a kind of, it wasn't a fixed band. It was more of a collective, or like an idea which then people would come in and out of.
Yeah, yeah.
No, that's great. I actually I founded a collective called the Cymatics Collective. I don't know if you know what cymatics are, but it's basically the visual representation of sound. So like it could be,
Mm.
the way sound waves affect sand or water or oil or fire, and yeah. So this collective, I mean, we just recently went into the studio as a trio, which is a rather sort of conventional format, and recorded a free jazz album. Um, but the sounds that we used were very unconventional. Like, to give you an idea, the drummer was using cymbals that I intentionally rusted and hand hammered. The guitarist was using a bunch of analog pedals that are really hard to come by. Because he sort of is a gearhead, collects all this, like, obscure gear. And I was playing on like workstation keyboards, synthesizers, and a prepared piano, which had Tibetan singing bowls on it, on the strings.
Mm.
You know,
Nice.
so like, but of course, the idea of a collective is that it can be expanded or shrunk depending on the context, depending on what kind of what the requirements are of the space, or whatever. So I'm open to performing with symphony orchestras and then duos. It doesn't matter. Like, to me, the idea of the collective is that it doesn't matter how many people are playing. It really sort of matters that the this kind of experimental ethos is honored, no matter what the ensemble or format
Right.
is. Which I think was definitely the case with ear camera.
The practice in a way.
I think we cut out a little bit there.
Yeah.
Can you repeat the last thing that you said? Sorry.
The practice, the approach to music making is sort of more more central in that way.
Indeed.
But I don't know if I don't know if I entirely agree. I said that I said that, but also I don't know if I entirely agree. In that I think as a composer, and I machine where that can be, where parts can be swapped out at any point. I do think that there's a certain coming back to practice. There's a certain practice that's built up over time, and I don't think that we can skip that step of that time that it takes to get to know someone and to get to make music with someone. And that was another. I mean, that was another thing that I wanted to do with ear camera. One of my regrets with ear camera was that we ended up not having that much time together. And I mean, we also were a bit of a 10-headed horse in that we had 10 people with 10 different directions that where where it wanted to go. And so I think, you know, that um, that prolonged contact with people where you can come to consensus, I think, is very much, for me, an essential part of collectivizing. Um, that I think is not so modular in that way, that there really is something that needs to be core to the collective.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, and then there's also the question of, if you have such a democratic or such a egalitarian, sort of ethos, then, is there a place for leadership? Is there a place for somebody to take to take direction, or for somebody to be, uh to take the lead as a composer or conductor or whatever? These are all central questions. Um
Yeah, and
and
something I've been thinking about since ever since, basically.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, the symphony orchestra, is very hierarchical. In that, the composer is God, and then the conductor is sort of like, the prophet, or like, and then it's sort of, it gets everything, the message gets passed down, and eventually you have, the fourth violin, who has no say. There's not a two-way street; it's a one-way street, and like everything is passed down, through this hierarchy. And I've never liked that about symphony orchestras. I've always thought that model was ancient, and sort of, and plagued with all kinds of problems. So I like the idea of ensembles that are more egalitarian, that have, the possibility for people to to make their voices heard, and to, to yeah, for there to be contention of some kind, because I think that friction is healthy. And a good collaboration which enables that kind of discourse is really, to me, much more interesting than a hierarchical structure where, the composer dictates everything, and then everybody has to do what the composer wants. um,
Yeah.
yeah, and there's an artist, who I quite admire and respect, Cameron Carpenter, who sort of, in his scores, he always writes that the performer is the ultimate authority. So yeah, the composer sort of has, this idea that they've put onto the page, but at the end of the day, it's the performer that's manifesting it, and it's the performer's decision what they want to do with it. You know. Um, and again, like, it's that question of, of control versus, versus sort of, relinquishing control, and that idea of surrender. um
Mhm.
and I guess in music, it's a very interesting question, because, like, for example, with aleatoric music, or, I don't know, generative music or algorithmic music, you have such different methods of production and dissemination, that it's almost, yeah, it's hard, like, as a artist or as a performer, to decide where you stand, or whether it totally depends on the context. Like, for me, it always depends on the context. I don't know about for you, but like, I can't decide whether I want control or whether I want surrender, just, until I've
Mhm.
actually put myself into the situation. I've understood what it is that the context is, and what it requires as well. What would best serve the situation.
Yeah, I think, I mean, when you're talking about control, I was thinking that that question of control is probably the central question of my music. Um, the past, you know, 5 6 pieces that I've written have all had control as an issue, that as a compositional issue. Um, in it, and it was very manifest in my work with your camera. But I think, for me, the idea of control shouldn't be so much a given. I am very much, uh, I think, as composers, often we're constrained in our thinking of how what we can view as a compositional choice. Um, often we think of, as a compositional choice, you got rhythm, orchestration, melody, harmony, stuff like that, the traditional compositional parameters. And for me, those are the things I'm probably least interested in. What I'm really interested in is, I'm interested in space. I'm interested in, um, control. and I'm interested in how people move and interact. Um, and so those become sort of central questions in my music, and I think this question of control can be in itself generative.
Right.
Um, that was my sort of underlying my thesis work at McGill was a certain question of control that was that where a pendulum swung between the conductor and the performers. So I accomplished that in certain ways. Like there's certain aleatoric elements and there's certain things that are. I mean, most of it is written out, which is something I kind of regret. Um, but there is an element of that. At certain points in the piece, the conductor signals something, and I've actually written a part for the conductor, uh, which is an extra element of control that I'm exerting as a composer on a performer who's traditionally not. I don't exert control over.
Right.
Um, and so sometimes the conductor's gesture correspond immediately to stuff that happens in the orchestra or in the large ensemble as it is, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes the individual members of the large ensemble act out in a certain way, and that drama of control and of sort of groundswell, which ended up being the point of the piece, is this, that these individuals express themselves and receive support from the ground up from the other members of the ensemble, rather than from the conductor. That narrative became the generative part of the piece, how I came up with my form and my materials and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that's more or less what I have to say about control. I also, I mean, I'm very interested in giving up my control as a composer. I mean, I've been moving recently to, like, I have a one piece that's entirely text, where there's no, I don't, I specify one note in the entire piece, but the rest of it is sort of generated by the what we would normally consider external factors. Like, it is a piece for solo tuba, and so some of the pitches come from the pipes that the tuning pipes that you take out of the tuba, the fundamental note of the tuba itself. So in that way, I give up my control over these certain creative aspects to give control to things that are outside of my control, like the instrument construction and potentially you know, things outside the hall, the people themselves who are playing, that I'm, as a white, despite being in a position of.
Hey. Yeah, the connection isn't yeah, it's being a bit funny. You were talking about this tuba piece, and you were saying that you're giving up control, but sort of you're the instrument, the build of the instrument is shaping the piece. The external factors like people in the hall stuff. I think that's the last thing I heard.
Oh, right. Yeah. So say so the and the people who are performing it, their particular bodies um and and thoughts often, um that that's those kind of things that I want to give up control towards. And I'm also, to broaden that analogy, I think as a white man, I should be in a position of giving up control. Um, even when occupying this relatively authority position as composer.
Um, yeah, the last thing that you said was yeah. Sorry about this. I don't know what's going on with the connection. I don't know if it's my end or your end, but if there is somebody streaming, or if there is somebody else using the internet connection, you may want to consider asking them not to. So that might improve the bandwidth.
What's happening?
Did you hear what I said?
No.
Oh, I said that potentially, you could ask people on your end to like not use the internet, or to not stream or not download anything, because that might be cutting into the bandwidth. Potentially, I don't.
Right. I don't think anybody's on the internet except me.
All right. Well, yeah. Anyway, so let's just continue then. You were saying that as a white man, that and in this position of authority as a composer, you were talking about giving up control, and you were talking about ceding ground, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that was where I ended was basically that it's um, that it's important and in my position to cede ground.
Well, I mean, I think it's good to acknowledge the privilege, and to acknowledge the position of power for sure, and I think that's a good step in the right direction, for sure. Um, yeah, and I would say like these kinds of questions of power and privilege, we can address them very directly and very succinctly through art and through music, because there's almost no space to hide in these positions, because you know yeah, it's very obvious, if you're in a position of power, in a position of control, and giving, like you said, giving up that position, or ceding ground, it's very important work, and I'm glad that you're doing it.
Yeah. I like to think of the concert hall stage, or any stage that where we're performing as a sort of laboratory test environment for what in a way the stage is a charmed space that we can where we can imagine and things can happen otherwise. In other ways it's very controlled and regimented, but I think in the limited ways that we can explore different ways of being with each other. And that's the thing that excites me the most about creating music and being a musician, is to be on these stages and to interact with people and to think about how we could interact with people otherwise in our day-to-day lives.
Indeed. Yeah, no, I like the idea of it being a laboratory, or being like a space where you can experiment. And then of course, like it is a very regimented space. It's a very controlled space. There are rules, there are traditions, received traditions. There are traditions that have come into practice in the last 100 years, which have sort of determined what things like stage etiquette, or yeah, and it also sort of depends on what tradition or what school of thought you're coming from, because the stage in a jazz context, the stage in a classical context, or the stage in a rock context are quite different. Um, and this kind of brings to mind Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, because that was a very interesting space, and that Frank Zappa was obviously exerting an immense amount of control, and sort of you know really sort of facilitating the making of the music. But at the same time, there was also this idea that people could bring to the table what they wanted, and there was also a little, yeah, there was control, and then there was also limited freedom.
So I missed the last question.
I was talking about Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, and I was saying that, obviously Frank
Mm-hmm.
Zappa was exerting quite a lot of control over the space and the situation, but at the same time there was also limited freedom where the players could express themselves and sort of do what they wanted, and so it was this idea of a kind of controlled or mediated freedom of some sort.
Right. Well, um, I think that's the. I mean, I think the thing that I've been thinking about since ear camera is not happening anymore is this idea of a band leader, um, and because a lot of the tension and in the ear camera was this idea of people of there not being leadership in a way, and part of that part of that was me. I wasn't in a position to exert sort of leadership in that situation, but um, there's a certain paradox of when there is absolutely no leadership, when there's no sort of direction or fixed point, it's hard to be to be free in a way. It's hard to be um, you end up with this the blank page syndrome times infinity, but there's also a blank idea of this ensemble. Um, One of my ideas to combat that with ear camera was to create a sort of flexible uh, leadership. So there would be a leader per group per concert. There could be a certain amount of leadership exerted by that person, or more democratic ways of working, but that would rotate between individuals per concert. Um, my What I think the thing that didn't happen to make that happen was that there needed to be further a person who was overseeing that process happening. But I think it wasn't a terrible idea, but I also think it is worth maybe trying out again.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and then there's always room for improvement, and there's always things that you learn from the trials, and yeah, it's an evolving process. Um, I wanted to ask you about your TED talk. Uh, and sort
How
of
many how many years ago was that now? That's like 6 years ago or something.
probably,
7 years ago.
yeah, 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 and it was given at UBC.
Yeah.
So um, yeah, I wanted to ask you about what you said, and to ask you if that's changed at all.
Yeah, I was gonna say I would probably qualify a lot of my positions in that TED talk now. Uh, I think the sort of central thesis is not a terrible one. I don't know if I'm that invested in discovering what Canadian music is now. Despite, I mean, I work at the Canadian Music Center, despite what I just said. But I think the idea of that Canadian identity is generative. That it's something that we're constantly creating as we live our lives
Yes.
within this. I think, I mean, now, uh, I think I would maybe try and problematize Canada as a concept a little bit more. That you, the idea of Canada has a particular political agenda that I may not subscribe to so much anymore. But um, um, so I think that sort of central concept that our identities are created as we live our lives. I think is considered. Um,
Hello.
and we're back.
Yes, we are. So
Hey.
yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right that the idea of the Canadian identity is generative, and even the concept of Canada is a problematic one, and it's a colonial one, and it's sort of despite it trying to be inclusive and despite the face of Canadian politics, it's still actually incredibly divisive and incredibly exploitative, and it needs to be critiqued, and it needs to be put in place and held in check, I think. And that work, I think, needs to be done by everyone, but I would say that as artists we do have a unique position where we can question it through our practice and through our through our process in a way that maybe other people might not have the same privilege to do.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think similarly in my discussion of the stage as a microcosm for being together. I think it's also I mean that can be metaphorized to larger societal issues, including kind of society itself, right? How it is that we exist in a space together somehow, um, and and I think music especially has a lot to say about that, um, and that's one of the things I am quite interested in. Um, and then that piece that I was talking about, the piece that was my thesis with McGill was sort of explicitly about statecraft, about how the state is at its core a collection of a body of bodies. It's a collection of organisms that relate to one another, and my goal in that piece was to think about how power structures can flip and can be um, uh, can can work maybe.
The last sentence that you said, power structures can be flipped, and then I didn't catch the last thing that you said.
I said work a little bit otherwise than we expected them to.
Right, right, right.
Um,
Well, and I think being political, or being a social, being involved in social justice issues is also like something that, well, something I certainly care very much about, and it's quite difficult to moderate these spaces where these kinds of conversations happen, because you have people of such varying worldviews and such varying cultural and socioeconomic and political viewpoints, and somehow we need to, like you're talking about, ceding ground, giving power, giving voice to the people that are not normally heard, or people that don't normally have power in these circles. I think I think these spaces need to become more transparent. There needs to be some sort of accountability mechanism where people are well, people are sort of, yeah, where people are able to be held accountable for what it is that they say, and what it is that they do.
Yeah. I mean, I agree entirely. You should be accountable for what you say. I think I mean, one of the things that I've been turning over recently, in response to some very very good work from people who are much more in this world than I am of thinking decolonial practicing and thinking about that. So I won't to to be accountable myself right now. I won't claim any ownership of these ideas at all, but things check out by design in a way that's not acknowledged in a lot of the spaces that as we live our lives. And I think especially important for composers and art makers is the spaces and the ensembles and all of that in which we make our music. And if we're not sort of staring them in the face for their for the ways in which they exert that pressure and that authority, and so that's in a way it ties into what I was talking earlier about questioning all the other aspects of music making other than the traditional ones of pitch, rhythm, orchestration, counterpoint, all that stuff.
Right.
That you really, as art makers, we shouldn't take any parameter for granted.
Yeah.
And that's includes and probably especially should include space and ensemble and power structures of how these ensembles operate.
Indeed, indeed. What I mean, what kind of instrumentation? Because you're talking about you're talking about sort of being interested in sound almost as an entity unto itself. What kind of sort of unusual instrumentation have you experimented with? You're talking about playing junk. You're talking about playing sort of.
Yeah, I'll actually maybe clarify for a second. I think I mean, you said that I'm interested in sound as an entity unto itself. That's not exactly it. I'm interested in musicians as entities unto themselves.
Okay. Okay.
Um, by and large, for someone who's whose artistic practice is sound, I care surprisingly little about sound. I mean, I care a lot about sound. In my personal life, I love music. I love chords and everything. I love music is beautiful and is nice. But in my artistic practice, by and large, I'm not so interested in sounding results. I mean, I am to a certain extent, but what I'm more interested in is the dynamics between people who are on stage, or the dynamics between a person and their particular instrument,
Right.
that they're playing. And so I have a series of solo works, one for tuba that I mentioned before,
Yeah.
and that's for I am working on another one for solo harp, and both of those pieces they're very much about how the individual interacts with their instrument as an entity,
Right.
to not take for granted
Hmm.
that this instrument is an extension of the performer, or something to be mastered in a way.
Right. So in that light, it's almost an anthropological study of it's a study of human interaction.
Yeah, Yeah, I think maybe maybe in another life I could have been an anthropologist, but
Well,
certainly, I
well,
mean,
maybe you are an maybe you are an anthropologist. Why would you not be an anthropologist? I mean, what you're doing, certainly could be considered a study of human behavior and a study of human interaction. So yeah, you're doing it through music, and you're doing it through an artistic lens, but that doesn't change the fact that the work that you're doing is anthropological in nature.
and I think sort of along that similar vein, um, a lot of the influence of my thinking on music was in my towards the end of my undergrad. I was involved. I was playing gamelan. I played gamelan through my entire undergrad, um, and I was getting more involved in ethnomusicology courses, um, and I found that the questions that ethnomusicologists pose about other cultures were very interesting, and sort of got at the point of music much more than theory and musicology did. Um, and I thought that it would be very interesting to turn those questions back on, Western culture, um, which I think is a very important practice. As I think if you're a person studying another culture or something like that, you should be aware of A, your gaze as a Western person, and B, the things that you're assuming and are assuming are universal in for Western music. And I think one of the things that's very interesting about ethnomusicology, the line of inquiry in ethnomusicology, is it gets at how music comes from culture. And when you start to think about that in reverse, or in reverse in quotation marks, um, you start to think about how our thinking of music in the Western world is also reflective of the Western worldview. Um, and so, um,
Yeah, and how the Western gaze is sometimes imposed on other cultures, and
for sure,
the viability, like for example, the viability of that musical tradition or that musical practice, in a Western context. And I think that those kinds of questions are sometimes quite well, they're anathema almost. They're not correct, because to judge another culture's viability according to your standards is the height of pretentiousness, I think. you know
yeah. And I think especially when it's like a lot of um, activists will say, do the work, like, right. It's like if you're gonna go um and look at other cultures and analyze where music comes from in there, and you haven't done that to yourself, um do the work, right.
yeah.
um and
Yeah.
so I think that line of questioning leads one to consider, like, okay, well, what are all of these larger structures of music making that exist and are sort of taken for granted in a lot of Western music making. And then I think to sort of um, bring it back to my study of individuals. I mean, I won't say study of individual, but to my thinking about individuals and their interactions.
Yeah.
Um, I think it sort of gets at a more kind of primal. I don't like the word primal. Like an underlying layer of what music is.
Sure.
That's not notes. That's not
Right. The stuff that happens in subconscious, or the stuff that happens at a deep at an intuitive, more like at a more like at a deeper level, perhaps.
yeah, yeah. And in a way, and at the I think more to the point, at the generative level of
Right.
when you consider music a practice, as a thing to do rather than an object, a thing to be done, um, then I think you have to be you have to be aware of the things that you're doing, right? And where, right? And that's where I would like my music to live, is as it's my, I don't want my music to be representative of an authoritative an authoritative object that is to be presented or represented. My ideal music is a practice that is to be done and to be enjoyed, um, and to be experienced rather than observed.
Certainly, certainly, and I like that. I like that aspect of your practice, and I would say the idea that experiential wisdom and experiential knowledge is much more powerful than something that is just read about, or something that's just sort of engaged with as a kind of as an inactive participant, or as an observer.
Yeah, yeah, and
Oh,
I think even in in a certain level of you're as a classical performer, if you're presented with a a score where everything is done, it's that seems a little bit to me a little bit less active than something that requires a little bit of input, some improvisation, some at least some analysis of how it was generated.
certainly.
uh, and I for me, I'm trying to figure out how I can make a score that's like an anti-score in a way, right?
Definitely, definitely. Well, and look, this brings up another issue, which is that really, to be a complete musician, you have to, you take on all the roles. You take on the role of interpreter, you take on the role of composer, you take on the role of conductor, and I mean, classical musicians in the past were improvisers, and improvising was an integral part of the practice. It's only in the 20th and 21st century that we've sort of dichotomized, or sort of separated, you know um, and the people into being only composers, or only conductors, or only interpreters, whereas a classical musician who lived in the Baroque, or the Renaissance, or whenever they lived, they improvising was an integral part of their practice, and it's how they learned
Mm-hmm.
to be musicians. So I think that needs to be reestablished. And I mean, as an organist, for example, you have to contend with the whole, French Romantic tradition of improvising. But like let's say you're a pianist. I mean, being an improviser as a classical musician is almost unheard of. Like they just, if you pull out, if you ask a classical musician to do an improvisation, they'll say, no, I can't do it. And I think that's something that's definitely lacking in the classical education system, and it needs to be reestablished as a practice.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I took a pretty a nice counterpoint course at McGill when I was there with Peter Schubert, and one of the things that I really love about Peter's approach um, is that he teaches counterpoint as a practice. Um, he says that this wasn't it's not a theory in a way. It's like there's there are correct and incorrect things to do, but it was generally a guide for improvisation that the monks would do based off plain chant, and it was how they would it was a practice. It was their everyday lives, and how things got written down was a particularly good improvisation or a particularly learned way of dealing with a certain plain chant or something like that would be written down, because that's, oh yeah, that's a good one. got to keep that in mind, you
Right.
know. Um, and I really love that idea of music as as music as a practice. It's not something that is imposed. It's something that you do. Um, I really love. the idea of compositions as laying kind of the groundwork for something to happen.
Right.
And I also, I really love, like you were talking about, classical musicians and Baroque musicians, they were improvisers, right? Because there was a common practice. We call it the common practice, but now we teach that as a framework of theory of analyzing music rather than as a theory of generating music.
Right.
And with good
As a
reason. I
live,
mean, there's enough common practice music out there.
there is, yeah.
Yeah, there's enough common practice, but um, but this idea, I think, there's a thing that happened in the 20th century where music is research. You should give me a university grant to research acoustics and music, and I'm going to make it math, and it's going to be great, and I'm going to get a tenured university job. And I don't blame musicians. I don't blame these composers. I actually like a lot of that music in a certain way, and I don't like a lot of it for other ways. But I think it was part of general sort of deculturalization of the West that happened in the 20th century, where we stopped thinking of what we were doing, our artistic practice as culture, and started thinking of it as research and as objective science, which I think was a total mistake, and I think also just not reality, because in doing that we masked a lot of the assumptions about culture and in a way furthered colonialism by making it more insidious, by couching it in scientific terms.
Right.
And I feel like, what happened when composers went in that direction, that, I'm doing research, only a specialist audience can understand it, is that performers went, okay, I can't understand it, so I'll just play it. And I think there's something, A, extremely antisocial about that, and B, I find it a very inhuman way of making music. And what I would like to see, and what I'm after in my own practice, is a more human way of music, making upon interaction and liveness.
Well, I think that's great that you're trying to make it a more human and more accessible practice. I think that's wonderful, and I definitely relate to that. Um, and then there's this idea that that doing these kinds of esoteric projects, or these kinds of what these kinds of academic things, has to be tied to an institution. So the idea that as a composer you have to have a university degree, or you have to go to university in order to sort of uh, you know further your practice or whatever. um, and I mean that's fine. I mean I don't have anything against universities or institutions. It's just I think somehow being on the outside, or being I guess the term I use is an outsider's insider, where you have access to the institution, you have access to the spaces, you have access to the people, but the actual work that you're doing is maybe outside of that, because then you have the freedom, because you were saying you're feeling constrained. Then you have the freedom to do the work that you really want, and sort of at the same time also have access to the facilities of the institution.
That's the best of both worlds.
Yeah, and maybe that's my rampant idealism, but that's kind of what I envision for myself. You know.
It's as I say, it's a good gig if you can get it, right?
Well, I've been pretty lucky. Like, I mean, I guest lectured at the University of Dar es Salaam, and that was an interesting gig, because on one hand, I had total freedom. Like, nobody was saying this is what your course has to be about. What I basically designed the entire course myself, and I had no PowerPoint, no presentation, no notes, nothing. I just went in and just had a happening, basically. And 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 I was really surprised that I was able to do that. But at the same time, like I think that it was perfectly logical, perfectly justified to to do that. And I think the students responded really well to that, and I responded well to that because I had the freedom then to like create these frameworks where people could sort of question uh question the context and question the even the things that were being established by their respective practices, because I was not just teaching music students. I was teaching, it was a humanity. I was teaching the arts and humanities department, so there was people there from film, from architecture, from design. So
Hmm.
it was kind of an interdisciplinary classroom, and in that sense it was very interesting because we did a collective improvisation where everybody was sort of responding to what was going on in the room. And you had people that were drawing, you had people that were reading, you had people that were making sound and making music, you had people that were moving, doing yoga, doing dance, doing, it was really interesting because like it was this collective like space of interaction. And like to me that's the classroom of the future, that kind of lived experience.
I I agree, and I think that's the artwork of the future as well. I'm very much into um, I'm very much into community art, and I think generally, if you look at historical community art, it isn't bounded by genres. You have all these intersecting things of visual arts, dance, and music and stuff like that, and they're like this. You can't separate one from the other,
Yeah.
and I think we've siloed so much in the West that. That is a problem. We lose some richness in that way. I know I understand. I understand the position of siloing and specializing as a way of really going into depth in your field. But I also think that there's something that's really lost when you don't have these cross-disciplinary discussions, and you don't have these, if you're a painter and you don't make sound, feel like there's something lost in your thinking about art. And similarly, if you're a musician and you don't know about film and you don't know about visual arts, there's something lost in 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 how you can conceptualize.
I didn't really catch the last thing you said. It broke up a bit. Something about conceptualizing something. I didn't catch the last thing you said, Joseph.
Oh, so that if you're, um, I understand the perspective of why people siloed into their arts, because you can really kind of drill down into the nitty gritty of your art practice.
Right.
But I think that there is also something lost in conceptualizing of art with a capital A, when you have blinders to your genre. And as a painter, not knowing music theory, or being able to
Right.
listen in a way that musicians listen, and being a musician who doesn't know about the conversations that are happening in visual arts or film. I think there's something that is lost in that, um, as that we all sort of lose out as a culture by not talking to each other.
Quite. Yes. Well, and I would say as well, like being conversant with all the different disciplines is so important. I mean, as a musician, it's important to make to understand the sartorial impact of what it is that you're choosing to wear. And to understand the visual aspects of, for example, being presenting a film, or like like you said, like providing accompaniment for a film. Like you have to be conversant with all these other practices. And I think that, like you said, it ameliorates, it richens the the tapestry that we live in, or that we exist in as artists. And not acknowledging the all these other practices and disciplines, I think definitely is a detriment to to your practice.
I agree. 100%.
Well, hey, it's been such a pleasure to have this conversation with you, Joseph, and I look forward to seeing what you continue doing, continue working on. And you work for the Canadian Music Center. That's well, I've been yeah, they invited me to do a like a residency in 2021. I was gonna do like
Yeah.
a performance art or installation based residency with bringing in a bunch of my hand hammered cymbals, and also like playing the piano, and having like djembe and flute as well, and kind of you know like a multi-day residency. And yeah, I think I mean, hopefully COVID is uh, less of a problem, hopefully. uh,
Over by then.
yeah, hopefully. But you know to, let's be realistic, I don't think it will be over, but hopefully people will have taken the vaccination, and in that way, it'll be a little bit safer to do these kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, I hope I'll see you there and and be able to help out in my way, and continue having conversations with you.
Well, thank you, and yeah, definitely. If you do put your camera back together, please let me know. I would even be interested in sort of trying to catalog the happenings that happen, because I think performance art is so ephemeral, and exists in the moment. So I think having a catalog, or having some sort of documented maybe writing or filmmaking, or something, some sort of archive that is then explained or contextualized or cataloged in some way. I think that's also an important practice.
And there's the last bit, something that exists in the moment.
Right. So I was talking about cataloging or contextualizing the things that happen within ear camera, like having a catalog, or having some sort of writing that sort of analyzes the performance, or analyzes the happening. I think that could also be an interesting practice, to have some sort of way to document or catalog.
Sure.
Like in the same vein as, like,
Well,
in a museum, you would have a catalog of the artworks, for example.
mm-hmm.
you know
Yeah, for sure. Well, I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Indeed. Take care. Bye.
All right.